In my personal opinion, Breath of the Wild still remains as the greatest Zelda game ever made, even after the release of Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, the sequel only pushed my love for Breath of the Wild to new heights. There are many reasons as to why I believe this game still outshines its predecessors and its successor, all of which I will go over in this video. So without further ado, this is my retrospective of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The intro sees Link awakening at the Shrine of Resurrection after 100 years of slumber due to the critical amount of damage his body received after fighting in the war against Ganon all those years back. The tutorial here is very brief, with Zelda basically just explaining how the Sheikah Slate works. There's also a really crappy pair of clothes Link can put on before exiting the shrine. This whole opening was done in a spectacular way, as there is a rock you need to get over before the title sequence plays out, which discreetly introduces the player to climbing. After exiting the Shrine of Resurrection, you're thrust upon the Great Plateau, which to this day still remains as one of, if not the single greatest tutorials in any video game up to this point. There are numerous things that will catch the player's eye from the second they are given control of Link. The Temple of Time stands out as the main attraction, so most will probably attempt to head over there first, but even as early as this, there are little distractions peeling you away from the previous objective. For example, on the path to the Temple of Time, you can talk to the old man, who yells at you for taking his apple. You can jump into this ring to unlock a Korok seed, you can fight enemies, and so much more. The best part about the Great Plateau is that it doesn't feel like a tutorial in the slightest. All the player knows is that they can't leave the plateau without the paraglider, but within a few minutes, you're likely to even forget what the main goal is, simply due to the abundance of different things to tackle on this island. The introduction of climate changes is also displayed to the player here, as Link needs to cross through the freezing cold environment with some form of protection, otherwise he will die. So it's up to you, as the player, to discover a way to accomplish this. The game makes no attempt to hold your hand or outright tell you how to solve this, and that right there is the entire point of Breath of the Wild. There is no set solution for any puzzle, as you can go about any of them in any way you please. In order to enter cold environments, the ideal solution is to cook up spicy peppers, which creates a dish that is resistant to the cold weather. But you can also eat while sprinting through the area without using cold protection. And this just makes for an experience which every player will no doubt remember for years to come. You can even find the warm doublet here if you take the time to scale up this little area, which completely negates the need for cold resistant food for the rest of the time you spend on the Great Plateau. Once spending enough time here, Zelda will direct Link to the first tower in the game, which acts as a warp point for Link, but not only that, it also fills the map out in whichever region the tower is located in. Including one of the towers on the starting area was genius because it shows how useful they can be, thus accentuating the excitement in players wherever they see a glowing orange tower in the distance. Shrines are also introduced here, and the way this is executed is nothing short of brilliant. The old man tells Link that if he completes one shrine, he will give him the paraglider. So this just adds even more anticipation, but what he doesn't mention at first is how there are actually 4 shrines on the Great Plateau that must be completed in order to gain access to the paraglider. These 4 shrines act basically like tutorials for different runes used within the Sheikah Slate. These runes are incredibly useful throughout the entire game, so it's nice that they were fleshed out here, rather than just being handed to Link. Stasis allows you to freeze most objects, and if you hit them with a certain amount of times, the object will go flying whenever the timer runs out. This is not only useful for puzzles, but also opens the way to some incredibly fun and inventive glitches which are still relevant to this day. Magnesis turns every metal object into a playing ground for Link, and allows him to move any metal item wherever he wants. You can do some pretty cool stuff with this, and if used correctly, you can even take down frustrating enemies. Cryonis allows you to place up to 3 ice blocks on any form of water, which can be incredibly useful early on in the game when you don't have much stamina and need to traverse long bodies of water. Lastly, the bombs come in 2 different variants, those being rounded and square bombs. This solution is so much better than forcing the player to find bombs along the way, much like every other Zelda game. They don't do much damage, but giving the player an unlimited supply of these ensure that they will be able to access any challenge right from the get-go and never have to worry about running out. So once you finish all 4 shrines here, the old man finally meets up with Link and tells him to meet at the Temple of Time. The reward for clearing a shrine is a Spirit Orb, which can either grant Link an extra heart container or an increased stamina gauge. That right there is a sheer definition of freedom. Allowing the player to choose what they want to do with their reward makes room for so many different playstyles and lends an incredible amount of replayability to this game. They even went as far as to give you an option to swap heart containers for stamina vessels, and vice versa if you find yourself needing more of one over the other. Speaking of freedom, once meeting up with the old man, he drops exposition and explains that he's actually the former king of Hyrule who died along with all the champions during the Great Calamity 100 years ago. None of that really matters to us though, considering we just got ourselves a paraglider, meaning the adventure can truly begin. This part of Breath of the Wild completely overwhelmed me on my first playthrough, years ago, in the best way possible. The king directs Link towards Kakariko Village, and that is by no means required, as you can literally go the entire game without even visiting Kakariko. In fact, it's almost impossible to not immediately get distracted and head off in a completely different direction because you see a shrine, tower, enemy encampment, or something else you want to tackle. One thing I actually really like about the story here is that it is almost exclusively portrayed to the player through the eyes of different characters throughout the world. Random NPCs explain how they feel about the Great Calamity, or something else related to Ganon or the Divine Beasts. There's also the memories which can be searched for, and play a brief cutscene of an event that took place all those years back. I do find most of these memories to be a bit underwhelming, but in concept I love the idea of having to travel to different locations in order to trigger Links to remember something crucial from before he was wiped out. And besides, with the world this big, I'm sure the story wasn't the main priority this time around, as crafting an immersive environment for the player to get lost in was no doubt in the forefront of every developer's mind.
Gee, this is uplifting.
And I don't think it's a surprise to say that they absolutely came through and delivered something that may never be topped or recreated by any other game studio for decades to come. Where to even begin? Hyrule this time around is so massive that there really is no definitive starting point when talking about it. The enemy variety, while not huge, definitely works well with the environments they were placed in. But the best part about the enemies is that they aren't just mindless drones walking around. They all have distinct personalities. For example, one moment you'll encounter a Lionel, the toughest enemy in the game, which are extremely smart and very versatile, containing a large arsenal of deadly equipment. But on the other end, you can spy on a bokoblin hunting down a boar by twirling a spear above its head while riding a horse. The Hinox are these big clownish enemies, and their battle theme captures that perfectly. There are a few more enemies such as the Lizalfos, which are lightning fast and dodge most of your attacks if you don't pay close attention to them, and the Moblins, who are these giant pig-like creatures that pack a hefty blow. Every character and enemy in Breath of the Wild is stuffed full of personality and charming quirks, and it only serves to flesh the world out further. This brilliant design is carried on throughout the game's many shrines as well. These aren't always a case of just finding and walking into them, and while there are plenty that only require just that, tons of them can be accessed through some elaborate quest. Some of these side quests can be extremely engaging, and I find it very enjoyable to complete a challenge only to be rewarded with a shrine for my efforts. The greatest example of this is within Eventide Island. Upon landing here, all of Link's equipment and clothes are taken from him, and as a player you are required to collect 3 orbs and bring them to their pedestals in order to unlock the shrine. What makes it so enjoyable is the feeling of being vulnerable again. Having to scavenge your way through this place and sneakily hunt down the enemies replicates a feeling that is only present in the early stages of the game, where you have no powerful materials or equipment. On top of that, one of the orbs is guarded by a Hinox, so you can either choose to carefully nab the orb from its chest, or just fight it like I'm sure most of us did. Accomplishing all of that opens up a shrine, which is one of the most satisfying experiences of the game. Now I won't lie, there are a few duds in there. There's a test of strength shrines, which are repeated a bit too much if I'm being honest, and the challenge is always the same, with each one being a minor, modest, or major test of strength and only requiring Link to take down a single guardian before being rewarded with the Spirit Orb. These are disappointing because you have great shrines like the aforementioned Eventide Island, but then you have shrines like this where all you need to do is take down one enemy to get the same reward you get for fighting a Hinox in nothing but your underwear. But perhaps the most notorious shrines are the ones requiring motion controls to complete, which even I have to admit are just plain awful. It's like Nintendo just had to throw a bit of Nintendo in there, you know? They just had to force motion controls on the player in some parts of the game, because that's just how Nintendo rolls. but these are few and far between and will never take away the enjoyment I get from the rest of the shrines. And with the amount of freedom given to the player in this game, almost every shrine can be completely cheesed if you know the right method, which is always a blast to pull off. One thing that got an unnecessary amount of backlash from the community was the soundtrack used for this game. After all these years, I still don't understand how anyone could dislike the soundtrack here. The piano takes the forefront in Breath of the Wild, and I don't think it could have been executed any better than it was here. The subtle piano notes played throughout the day and night express a certain loneliness and really show how Hyrule really has fallen and shattered to ruins. The main villages and divine beasts get their own unique soundtracks though, and all of these sound spectacular. Hyrule Village in particular is so good that I find it hard to even leave this place once the melody kicks in. It's so beautiful, and I think the musical direction used in this game was one of the smartest decisions Nintendo ever made with Breath of the Wild. One thing that people don't seem to think was smart was the durability system. Forcing every sword, shield, and bow to break after enough usage was heavily criticized by the fanbase, and personally, I don't mind it at all. I mean, think about it. If every weapon had unlimited durability, what would even be the point of collecting new items? One of the most enjoyable aspects to Breath of the Wild is going out and searching for new powerful materials that can strengthen Link's arsenal and take down enemies much quicker. All of that joy and curiosity would have been stricken from the game if even a single weapon was made unbreakable, but that's just my opinion. The only item in the game that I believe should have been unbreakable, or at least a bit stronger, is the Master Sword. This is literally the sword that seals the darkness, so it makes no sense that it has to recharge after a certain amount of usage. At that point in the game, I feel as though the player has accomplished enough to wield the sword permanently. However, I do like how the sword glows and doubles in damage whenever Link is surrounded by Malice, Guardians, or in a dungeon. And it's particularly a neat touch how it shoots out beams whenever you're at full health. Speaking of dungeons, the Divine Beasts take that role, and I gotta be honest, looking out into the distance and seeing one of those things moving around had me intrigued from the very start. On my first playthrough, I remember being completely blown away when I realized that these would function as the game's dungeon. In theory, this is one of the coolest ideas I've ever seen in a video game, but in execution, it sort of falls flat. Now let me explain why. For starters, I don't think the actual dungeons themselves are bad. I really like how you can solve any puzzle in any order you want so long as you have the skill to do so. The soundtrack in these are all immaculate as I stated earlier, but my biggest problem here simply comes down to theming. Each of the 4 Divine Beasts look exactly the same on the inside. Every wall, ceiling, and floor, and contraption shares the exact same ancient-looking theme that we've already seen in all the shrines up to this point. I think if these were given more diverse atmospheres, then they wouldn't get as much hate as they currently do today. And they also would have been far more enjoyable to traverse through. The other big issue with these is the boss fights residing in each one. Every Divine Beast has some form of Ganon that you fight after finding all the terminals, and these are known as the Blights. Thunder Blight, Water Blight, Fire Blight, and Wind Blight all look incredibly similar and all play out in pretty much the exact same way with the exception of Thunder Blight Ganon. This fight can be very tough if you don't have the Master Sword because it moves at blinding speeds, and its usage of lightning means that you can also lose your weapons if you're not careful. As for the rest of the Blights, you can really just hack away at them until they are defeated, and Fire Blight Ganon tries to distinguish itself by using a fire shield for protection, forcing you to throw a bomb at it to remove the shield, but this doesn't work too well and it's just far too easy to take it down, so it poses no real challenge. A concept that would have been much more interesting to see could have had Link fighting a corrupted version of all the champions and defeating them remove some curse they had placed upon them, or something in that realm of ideas. But again, most of the work went into creating Hyrule itself, and the dungeons are just one area where I think Tears of the Kingdom really improved upon its predecessor in every way. So you might remember how in the beginning of this video I said you could jump through a ring in the water in order to unlock a Korok seed? Well, now's the time to talk about their actual usage in the game, because these are extremely useful. Korok seeds are given to Link once you solve a very brief puzzle somewhere out in the overworld. This could be something like diving through a ring in the water, matching 2 metal structures together, or some other odd interaction with the Korok. These Korok seeds granted to Link allow him to upgrade either a shield, sword, or bow slot in the inventory, allowing him to carry more of whichever item you choose. You give these seeds to Hestu, who does a lovely little dance before upgrading the inventory via one slot. The more you choose to upgrade your inventory, the more Korok seeds are required, which adds great incentive to search these guys out. And considering there are literally 900 seeds to find throughout the game, it's pretty common to just stumble across them from time to time. So you should have a pretty hefty inventory by the end of the game. This system just instills even more curiosity and drive into the player by promising one of the most substantial rewards for using their brains and noticing one of these little puzzles floating around Hyrule. Now, if there's one thing I really dislike about Breath of the Wild, it would be the rain. Usually when it starts to rain in a video game, the atmosphere is very subdued and relaxing. Meanwhile, in Breath of the Wild, the main gimmick of the game, climbing, is made near impossible under any sort of rainfall. It would have been one thing if the rain just slightly halted your momentum, but making it basically just flat out undoable is just pushing it too far. You either have to build a campfire to sleep in or spend rupees to sleep at an inn, but who wants to do that? That is a total immersion breaker and a shame because the rain could have created a calming atmosphere, when instead it just grinds the game to a halt. Granted, if you have Rivali's Gale, this is made much easier, but nonetheless, it's still a tedious nightmare whenever you're trying to scale a large cliff and it starts to rain. Speaking of Rivali's Gale, this is one of the 4 champion abilities you earn for completing a Divine Beast. These 4 abilities include Mipha's Grace, Urbosa's Fury, Daruk's Protection, and Rivali's Gale. I like these abilities much more than the ones seen in Tears of the Kingdom, mainly because these seem to fit the world much better. Using Rivali's Gale to fly up a large mountain is extremely useful, and since you can only use this 3 times before it needs to recharge, it never becomes a cheat, rather a reward for saving it up until you really need it. Urbosa's Fury comes in handy whenever you need to take an enemy out that's out of your reach. Daruk's Protection grants Link a shield which counters everything and can be used 3 times. And finally, Mipha's Grace acts like a much more powerful version of a fairy, fully recovering all of Link's health and adding temporary hearts on top of that. All the champion's abilities lend the player more tools to play around with in this world, and it could cause some people like myself to be more daring and attempt more difficult challenges because of the new tools added to Link's arsenal. One supremely underwhelming aspect of this game is the side quests. They aren't bad per se, but 90% of them involve something as little as collecting mushrooms or any other minor item. And while these smaller side quests are nothing special, I can't say the same for the larger quests. I'm mainly talking about the Hylian Homeowner and Terrytown missions. In order to even begin Terrytown, you need to have at least finished the Hylian Homeowner side quest, which is just great. You can literally build a house for Link, or at least pay these guys to do it, and the end result pays off in spades. In order to build this house, you need a few thousand rupees and a lot of wood. Gathering this wood in particular can become pretty tedious after a short amount of time, but it's totally worth it because once you do this, you get a house and a bed to sleep in whenever you want to for free. But the best part about all of this is that you can upgrade the house from being extremely bland and basic to containing tons of little trinkets such as the weapon holders which allow you to do just that. This is very nice, especially when you get the champion's weapons because now you can have a safe place to store them without worrying about breaking each one. And this leads straight into Terrytown, which is my favorite side quest of the entire Zelda franchise. What makes it so great is the execution. Sure, it sucks having to gather more wood, but having to travel to the different regions of the game in search of whoever Hudson requests is very comforting. There's a certain feeling of satisfaction I get whenever I watch one of these characters walk away and towards Terrytown, because each time you return to Hudson for the next task, you'll see a subtle change in the town along with the brilliant touch of the music changing ever so slightly to include the main instruments of each race you send to the place. This all culminates in Hudson marrying the Gerudo who started tailoring his clothes, which wraps his whole quest up into one very nice bow. Another important mission in the game is lighting up the way to the ancient tech labs using blue fire from a torch. This is fine the first time around, but Robbie's tech lab can usually be pretty frustrating and tedious. Especially if it rains, which it tends to do here a lot. That's when you just glitch the game into letting you run and glide with the torch so you can fly on over there. It's totally worth it to do this though, because then you unlock the ability to purchase several types of ancient weapons, along with the Guardian armor, which comes in great handy when fighting them. This is one of the best aspects to Breath of the Wild, that being the fact that every single little task you complete will end up being rewarded in some way, even if it's just something small. It adds so much content to the game that it blows my mind every time I play it. Another thing that blows my mind is how the ending is handled. The fact that you can just storm into Hyrule Castle and literally take on Ganon right from the start of the game is insane. The developers knew most people wouldn't be able to actually pull this off, but leaving it as an option was still a great choice because at literally any point in the game, if you feel like fighting Ganon, you totally can. Nothing will try to say you can't. The most rewarding way to do this, however, is by exploring the world, finishing the Divine Beasts, and just decking Link out with powerful equipment so that he can obliterate anything on his way to Ganon. The finale is completely in the hands of the player, as it can be as easy or difficult as you want it to be. If you took the time to complete each of the 4 Divine Beasts, then they will instantly remove half of Ganon's health bar, which could be up for debate on whether this is a good or bad thing. I don't particularly think it was necessary to remove so much of the challenge, but at the same time, this helps speed up following playthroughs, leading to a less tedious experience. The fight with Calamity Ganon himself is pretty easy, but still neat from a spectacle point of view. I particularly like how in the second phase, you have to parry the lasers back at him in order to remove his invincibility. However, as said by numerous people, Dark Beast Ganon is a complete joke. But you know what, I'm okay with this, because the atmosphere is completely unmatched anywhere else in the series, with the exception of the dragon fight from Tears of the Kingdom. The fight against Dark Beast Ganon more so functions as a glorified cutscene for the game to end off on. All you need to do is shoot the glowing points on his body, and then shoot the giant eyeball on his head to destroy him. What I love about Breath of the Wild is that this game is much more about the journey rather than the destination. The fun in this game comes from the complete freedom on offer to the player, and the choice to do whatever you want, whenever you desire. This game revolutionized the open world genre, and since then we have had countless attempts by other studios to create something as magical as this experience. But in reality, nothing has ever even come close to being on par with Breath of the Wild. The sheer amount of curiosity this game exudes while playing it is unmatched in any other video game I have ever played, and I have never been so enamored with the world and its environment quite like I am with Breath of the Wild. The Zelda team really delivered something special with this entry, so here's to a long and prosperous future of this outstanding franchise, and I can only hope Nintendo never forgets what made this experience so special and why millions of people will forever hold this game fondly in their hearts.